meeting over the next 5 days to actually begin to think critically in very concrete, simple terms around how we move what is coming out of the symposium forward. But for us, what is the personal commitment that we are going to give to actually say that we've spent 5 days here, we've spent a lot of money, we've been very nice around it, but what is it that personally we are going to do and take that to a national level, into a regional level?
They include protecting women and empowering women and starting earlier to get these messages every space that we possibly can. This work also means about figuring out how we talk about social justice and social inequality at the level of households, that we figure out how our poverty alleviation programs can also take into account gender. We have seen with evidence in the last years, and the organization I work with, ICRW, has done a lot of work around women's economic empowerment, which has been one of the success stories about in the international development field in the last years. But it's also important that we recognize that those programs are not enough. That too often we continue to reinforce the notion that women are the super caregivers and we let men get off the hook. We continue to reinforce that women are working outside the home and inside the home, and we let men off the hook when it comes to that work inside the home. You heard it from the Reverend Bafana, men don't lose their manhood when they change nappies, and we actually can do it. And it would be interesting if we could figure out ways that we convince more men that those simple acts of caregiving can be quite transformative in terms of how children look at the world, in terms of how men look at the world, and in terms of how women look at men and what men can do as partners. It's also key that we look at how to take this work into post-conflict. You don't need me to stand up and talk about how conflict continues to devastate much of the African region, as it does many other parts of the world. How can we figure out how gender fits into that? How can we take seriously the Security Council resolutions that want to engage women in peace negotiations and in post-conflict work? Figure out how we can engage men as not only the combatants, but also as wagers of peace, just as they have too often been involved in waging war. And understanding, as we look at the reintegration programs that are happening throughout the region, that we can't think that simply handing men a hoe and some seeds and a small plot of land is enough to transform identities that have been shaped in conflict. That we have to be much more creative and far-reaching to figure out how we engage men to go from being combatants and warriors to being citizens and caregivers at the home and in their communities. And finally, as a note to help move us along, I want to leave you a little bit uncomfortable here. While it is important that we acknowledge and celebrate the work that's happening out there, there's a few key things that I think are important about clarifying. MenEngage as a network is not about helping 400 NGOs or 800 men affiliated with those organizations feel good about their work in gender equality and say that we're somehow different than our brothers out there and to celebrate us. We are not celebratory of us being different until we figure out ways that the 30% of our brothers who are using violence against women stop doing that. This work cannot be simply saying it's a handful of NGOs, it's a handful of organizations. It is about questioning those gender inequalities that pervade all of our lives here. I think it is important to affirm as well that while we do want to find the positive as men look at ways to change, that we want to encourage men to look at how their lives can be better as well as they embrace change. We do have to acknowledge that men have to give up privilege. We have to be willing, like our colleagues in Cambodia, to look other men in the eyes and say there are some aspects of our lives where we hold privilege and we have to be willing to give it up. The world is not fair where we as men earn on average 20% more than women do, even when we do the same work. It is not fair that as women are entering the workplace outside the home in numbers nearly equal to men, that women do 3 to 4 times the amount of caregiving work around the world. That duality of women doing more caregiving work and men making more money is the motor of this great thing of inequality that we need to take on. And it does require men questioning that privilege. And finally, I want you to look around, and while we thank Sonke for pulling this together and the fantastic hotels that we're staying at and the travel agencies that have brought us here and this really cool space that we're in, we know what it costs to do this. In For those of us who work at the local level, we know lots of other things that we could do with the funds. I think we have an ethical obligation as we forge ahead in this work to say we've got to come out of these days with something concrete. We've got to go back home with some concrete ideas to make this work go to scale and to achieve the kind of change that needs to happen. And if that ethical shaming doesn't work, then let me cite my 11-year-old daughter. As I was leaving home on a trip that took me to Cambodia for Southeast Asia consultation, and then here, and then I'll cross back on the Atlantic side, she reminded me that the time that I will spend in airplanes alone will require me to plant 6 trees to overcome the damage that I've done in terms of my carbon footprint. So if nothing else, if we're not ethically shamed, then let me make it very personal and say, she will bug me to plant those 6 trees when I get home, and she will want to know what I did that was worth being away from home that long, and for doing that damage to the environment. So as a empowered girl, I certainly hope that you take her seriously, because I definitely have to. And finally, I want to urge us, as the men working in this issue, I want to remind us of words of a colleague of ours, Alan Gregg, who's inspired a lot of us as well, to remind us as men to be humble on this work. I hear too often in women's rights organizations, too often we hear that, oh, when men come along, we take over space. Too often we begin to celebrate, oh, look, men are doing this, because somehow men don't seem to change unless we get awarded medals or we get held up as being heroes in our work. It is important that we keep a strong notion of humility in this. This work emerges out of, we affirmed that at Rio, we affirmed that in the core principles of MenEngage, and we need to remind ourselves of it every day, that this work was born out of the women's rights movement that has been so key to transforming our lives, women's lives, and the world in general. That's where this work is building on. And I think we need to be mindful of that every day in this work and hold ourselves accountable to that. And to say, as we forge ahead in making this about work with women and men and boys and girls, we are building on the legacy of the women's rights movement. I'd like to acknowledge the women here who are present, who believe that men can change, or I think you do, or at least you may be skeptical about it, but you're willing to listen to us for a few minutes. I'd like to say that you need to be patient with us, that we're not done, and that we very much want to work hand in hand as we drive this work ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you for a superb speech and presentation.
But I've had the privilege of serving as the Africa MenEngage coordinator for a year and about 6 months. And I live and work in South Africa, but I've often been referred to as Nigerian or Ghanaian. So I don't think that's why I was co-opted to this position for this time. But for me, just to share with you the history, basically, you know, focusing on the country networks that has happened. I must say that in Central and Northern Africa, we didn't do well, and as part of our way forward is to say, let's get our Central and Northern African brothers and sisters in a network in Rwanda. There were challenges there of government wanting to take over, but we stood firm and said, no, government will be our partner, and the network continued from that strength of having partnerships with government, and they started doing some work, battled a bit with getting a steering committee moving. You may agree with me that in any meeting, I think you need to have authority first, meaning people can make decisions. But why? Decisions based on what? So second to that, I believe that you need to have information, and then you need to have a purpose. And lastly, there should be needs that you need to meet. That's why you're having that meeting, and you have to make decisions. And based on your purpose and the information that you have, then you can meet the needs. I think with the global MenEngage body, we're privileged enough to have information. If you read the concept paper,